We're going to talk about monomials and polynomials in this tutorial. So in order to understand what a polynomial is, it's important to start with a monomial. So we have the term monomial here. Its definition is a number, a variable, or the product of a number and one or more variables. So a number like 6, that's a monomial, or a variable like x is a monomial. We can also find the product of a number and one or more variables. So for instance, 5 times y. 5y would be a monomial. If I wanted to do 5 times y, that could be 5y squared. So sometimes monomials you'll see have exponents because y squared is really just y times y. It's a product of multiple variables. You could even have something as big as, 13x to the 7th y to the 9th z. That is still a monomial because it's just the product of a number and multiple variables. Some characteristics that are important to know about is that a monomial will not have any division by a variable. So for instance, you can't have something like 4 divided by y. That division by y means that it's not going to be a monomial. You also can only have whole number exponents. Remember, whole numbers are numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So something like 5y squared is okay, but 5y to the 1/3 power is not because that exponent is not a whole number. So then what's a polynomial? Well, a polynomial is a monomial. So if you just had a monomial like 4x, that's considered a polynomial. But there's other polynomials as well. And it comes from taking the sum, which we know means adding, or difference, which means subtracting, multiple monomials. So 4x is a monomial and so is 7y. If I were to take those and add them and find their sum, then this is considered to be a polynomial. Again, if you have a monomial like 13x squared y to the 9th and another monomial like 5m to the 4th, subtracting them and finding their difference means that this entire thing is a polynomial. Sometimes you'll have just 2 monomials, or maybe you'll have even more. It could have 3 or 5 or 20. It could be pretty large. So we're going to learn how to name polynomials today, and we're going to be naming them based on 2 different characteristics that they have. The first is their degree. This is probably a term that when you think degree, you think either the measure of an angle or a temperature, but this is going to be something new for that term degree. And then the second part of their name comes from the number of terms that the polynomial has. So we're going to go into both of those. And I'm actually going to come back to the degree. I'm going to start with the number of terms. So I'm going to go to this table on your notes. So terms are always separated by addition and subtraction. When I'm talking about the number of terms, I'm basically asking you how many monomials are there. So think about that question. How many monomials are there? So an addition sign and a subtraction sign, we know that those are used to separate monomials. So if you have only one term, we already know that this is called a monomial. For example, 5x squared. This is only one term because there's no addition or subtraction. It's a single monomial. If we have 2 terms, that means that we have 2 monomials being added or subtracted. Something like 2x and 9 being subtracted. 2x minus 9, here's your first term, and then negative 9 would be your second term. So when you have 2 terms, we call this a binomial. You can think of bi like bicycle has 2 wheels. If you have 3 monomials added or subtracted, so maybe you have something like 4x squared plus 2y minus 1. Here's your first monomial, 4x squared. Positive 2y is a monomial, and negative 1 is a monomial. So when you have 3 monomials, that means 3 terms. we consider this a trinomial. And then typically anything that has 4 or more terms, we're just going to use the blanket term polynomial. That means many terms. So something like 5x cubed plus 4y minus 3 plus 10x minus 25z. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different terms there, so that's going to be considered a polynomial. So the number of terms makes up the second part of the name. I said I was going to go back to talking about degree. So let's take a second and do that. So to find the degree, again, this does not mean degrees in an angle measurement or degrees Fahrenheit for temperature. This means something new. So when we're looking for degree, it depends on if we're talking about only one term, meaning a monomial, or if we're talking about multiple terms. So some other type of polynomial. It could be a binomial, trinomial, or a polynomial. So if we're talking about only one term for a monomial, we have to find that degree in order to do that, we're going to find the sum of all exponents of all variables. So this means that, let's say if your polynomial was 5x squared y to the 7th, this is a monomial, right? So that monomial has a degree of what? Well, we have to find the sum of the exponents of the variables. So here's the exponents of the variables. We have a 2 and we have a 7, the sum of which is 9. So that means that this monomial would have a degree equal to 9. Let's try another one. If you had a monomial that was 7y, if I wanted to find the degree of this monomial, then I'd have to find the sum of all exponents of the variables. Well, this variable, I know I don't see the exponent, which means the exponent there is just a 1. And since it's the only exponent, the only variable, that means that the degree of this equals 1. Now, what if there are multiple terms? So if we have multiple terms, then you're basically going to look at each individual term's degree, and you're going to say that the largest one is the degree overall of the entire polynomial. So if these two were together and we made a polynomial that was 5x squared y to the 7th plus 7y, right? I took this monomial and put it here, this monomial and put it here. I added them together. So this is a polynomial. Then to say the degree of the entire polynomial, I look at each individual term and I choose the term with the largest degree. So this term, we already said, had a degree of 9, and this term had a degree of 1. So out of those two, 9 is the biggest. So the polynomial, the whole thing, has a degree of 9, the largest of the individual monomial degrees. All right, so let's talk about the naming process. If something has a degree of 0, this means that it is a constant. This means something like 4. This is when you only have a number and there's no variable, because technically, remember, something to the 0 power is equal to 1. So this would be like saying x to the 0 power is next to it. So it's to the power of 0, that means it has a degree of 0. We would call it a constant. If something has a degree of 1, it is considered to be linear. For instance, something like 3x, because x has a degree of 1, right? It has an exponent of 1, and it's the only term, so that monomial would have a degree of 1. You could also say something like 7x minus 3. In this case, this is a binomial because it has two terms, but it's still linear because look at each of the degrees of the individual terms. This term has a degree of 1 because the exponent of x is 1, and this term has a degree of 0 because there's not a variable there. So of the two, the largest is 1, which means overall the polynomial has a degree of 1. So If I were to name this, this would be a linear binomial. This one would be a linear monomial because it only has one term. Up here, this would be a constant monomial because there's only one term. If it has a degree of 2, this is called a quadratic. So for instance, a quadratic could be something like x squared plus 3x minus 9. Because even though it has 3 terms, so this is a trinomial, this term has a degree of 0, this term has a degree of 1, and this term has a degree of 2. So out of all the terms, this has the largest degree of 2, so overall it's a degree of 2. So we would call this a quadratic trinomial. If you had something like 5y squared, this would be a quadratic monomial. If I had plus 8 at the end of this, this would be a quadratic binomial. If something has a degree of 3, we call this a cubic. Something like 7x cubed, this is a cubic monomial. If we had plus 4y squared, this is still a cubic because this has the largest degree monomial compared to this. So overall, it's still a cubic, but it has 2 terms. So that would be a cubic binomial. Now, if you have a degree of 4, you could do one of 2 things. You could call it a quartic, but you could also say that you could have something like a 4th degree. If you had something like degree of 5, you would say 5th degree. So it's up to you how you want to go through and actually name that. Technically, a 5th degree could also be called a quintic. It's just not as common. So you could say 4th degree, 5th degree. If you had something with an nth degree, you would say nth degree polynomial. So a quartic, for instance, could be something like 4x cubed y, where you have the 3 plus the 1. That would be a degree of 4. So this would be a quartic monomial. Or if you added like 2x squared plus 9x, this would be a quartic trinomial, for instance.